On the very last page of the world's most mysterious manuscript lurks, as is only appropriate, one of the world's most mysterious inscriptions. 4 lines written in the Latin alphabet that to this day remain almost as undeciphered as Voynich itself. A lot has been written about what these words might mean, and a lot more could certainly be said, but not today. The focus of this talk is on the handwriting. Handwriting can, to some extent, be used to determine where and when a text was penned. It's ideally not the first or only thing you rely on to date medieval documents, but in the case of the manuscript nobody can read, we'll take anything we can get our hands on. So I decided to investigate. Can we figure out when and where the text on folio 116V was written through a paleographical analysis? Let's start by defining what we're actually looking at here. Is this a standard medieval Gothic script? When we think of Gothic letters, the first shapes that come to mind are those of black letter, which probably was the most widespread script in the late medieval period and so often appears in works of art. Albert de Rollet, author of Paleography of Gothic manuscript books, calls this style textualis, meaning book script. It's so typical of the Gothic period that it's also often just called Gothic script. Nearly all the strokes that make up these letters are thick and vertical, and even curved letters like C and O are instead written with straight strokes. In conjunction with frequent use of abbreviations, this horizontal compression of textualis allowed scribes to maximize the quantity of text fitting on a page. In Italy, as an example of geographic variation, variants of the script that were slightly less angular were often preferred, as exemplified by Manfredus Urbel, written in southern Italy at the beginning of the 14th century. The script was also used in early printed books. In the 20th century and even today, textualis has persisted in certain niches, such as newspaper titles and hard rock music. The Voynich marginalia belong to a different family of Gothic scripts, cursiva. These scripts began to be used in books in the 13th century and, as the name suggests, are based on informal cursive scripts like the Italian mercantesca. They allowed for faster writing by limiting the need to lift the quill from the page. Paper, as a cheaper alternative to parchment, probably also played a role in the success of cursiva. Since the compression provided by textualis became less relevant, cursiva uses single story A as loops on the ascenders of B, H, K, and L, and often D, and adds a pointy descender at the bottom of long S and F. It's easy to see how these features originated from fast and continuous writing. The script was functional for the ever-increasing production of manuscripts in the 14th and 15th centuries. But it also had an aesthetic appeal, and there are many high-end manuscripts where the same character shapes are written carefully and formally, with great calligraphic effects. In its various forms, cursiva was extremely popular all over Europe, in particular for the most informal manuscripts. That brings us back to the Voynich marginalia. In its main features, the marginalia script clearly falls in the broad category of cursiva, which is perfectly consistent with what we know about the Voynich manuscript. But isn't there anything more that we can extract from it? 2 years ago, in June of 2023, I was talking to Marco Ponzi about this, and we came up with a plan. In this video, I will first explain the method we ended up using, then we'll look at the results. Where did we find the best matches? And finally, what are the implications for Voynich studies? We focused entirely on this one folio. There are others, but we did not want to have to deal with the question of are they written by the same person, were they written at the same time? So we just wanted to eliminate variables and just look at the very last page of the manuscript. And we noted the properties for each letter we could confidently identify. We then used these to score a wide range of medieval text samples. The scoring works as follows. In a spreadsheet, we assign 1 when a property matches, 0 when it doesn't. For variable or borderline cases, we may also assign half a point. The results were then recalculated to 1 point per letter, and we took the average of these numbers. The higher this balanced average, the better the match. As you may expect, assigning a score to hundreds of samples of medieval handwritten texts involves a subjective component. Even though this is understood to be part of the paleographical process, we still try to limit this in several ways. First, by asking yes or no questions about observable features. This also eliminates factors external to the handwriting that might influence our perception, like the condition of the vellum, the lighting of the scans, or the color of the ink. Next, I approached this project without any preconceived expectations. Based on the opinions of people who knew more about medieval handwriting than myself, I knew the possibility of a later inscription had to be taken into account. So, as far as I was concerned, this could have been written by someone coming from anywhere in Europe at any time in the 15th century. Finally, when Marco and I found an exceptionally high-scoring sample, we had the results double-checked by the other person just in case a mistake was made, and we discussed any uncertain points. So, which characteristics define the script of Folio 116V? What we're going to do now is two things at the same time. I'm going to show you all the properties that, according to our understanding and our research, are typical for the Voynich marginalia script. And I'm also going to show in practice how this works. So we're going to analyze a sample together. I will randomly select one from monasterium.net, a charter from Austria, and we'll see how it compares. I have no idea if it will be a good one or a bad one, so let's have a look at that together. This would be entry number 383. These are sorted from best to worst, so here you just see the very worst samples we collected. There's no spoilers in there. I'll just fill in the data here. Okay, and now we can get started with our glyphs. So, let's start with the letter A. For A, we track three properties. First, it has to be a single story A. It has to be open at the bottom. So there has to be a gap here, and it may be a wide gap. And the angle here at the top is pretty sharp. So let's see how our sample compares. So we look for an A. Here's one, for example. Here's one. Here's one. So you can see in these three examples that they are not good at all. Of course, they're of the right type, so they are the single story A, but everything else is not good. There's no gap at all at the bottom, and this isn't pointy at all. It's a nice and round A. So I would rate this A1 here, 0, 0. So for the letter B2, we start with a broad categorization. It has to be looped. Second, the loop is often angular. Finally, this bottom left vertical stroke connects upwards to the loop without curving in too much. Let's see how our sample compares. Okay, so we got one here, one here, one here. We got three in a row here. Here, this one has a pretty big loop, kind of pointy, but not as dramatically pointy as in the Voynich, so maybe that's half a point there. What is very clearly a big difference is that this line here, it really curves back onto this vertical stroke, which you see very often with Bs, but the Voynich does something completely different. So going to our ratings, that's 1 for a looped B. I'll give this a half for the pointy loop, and this is definitely a 0. We did not separately compare the shape of C, because in the Voynich marginalia and similar scripts, it's often hard to tell it apart from T. For example, in this word, both the readings sere and tere are often taken into account. We do, however, have a few instances of a clear CH. As you can see here in our spreadsheet, the CH is not always found. That's because in Latin it generally does not occur unless you're lucky with a biblical name or some other kind of loan word. It's very easy to find it in German and some other vernacular languages though. So we notice two important properties here. One is that the C in the CH ligature is very curved in the Voynich text. And we note a clear gap between the C and the H. You should be able to quickly find the CH here. There's one right here in the beginning. The C is curved. It's not just a line that goes straight down. I would call this curved enough, but it touches the H and we want a clear gap here. We'll find another one for confirmation. There's one on the same line right here. So again, the C is curved. That's nice, but it touches the H. We don't want that. That's very simple. 1 for curved and a 0 for touching. In the 3 letters we've seen so far, there's something that's quite characteristic of the way this person writes, and I would call that a certain openness. For example, the A has an opening right here. It's not closed. The bottom curve of the B doesn't close itself. It remains open and only touches at the top. And the C doesn't touch the H. It again leaves an opening. We'll see more of that later. When there's a more open and a more closed form, the Voynich scribe tends to pick the open variety. Moving on, we get to what I consider the trickiest part of the marginalia. 2 forms of the letter D are relevant to us. The first is seen in this sample from around the year 1200. It's somewhat similar to modern cursive. However, in many 15th century medieval hands, the top line curves down to close the loop, resulting in something that looks like the number 8 with a flat right side. We can actually show this in the sample here. Oh, here's one for example. So this is the word das. And this is very interesting to us because it has D and also a short S. Short S is the form of S used at the end of words, in contrast to long S right here, but we'll get to long S later. So D and short S are both kind of H-shaped. So this D, you can see the ascender loops back down to the middle. And so you get almost an 8, but it's flat on this side. Short S is almost a mirror image of that. It's often smaller than D, but not always. And it tends to have like the flatter side here on the left, while D, it's on the right. Of course, these letters are formed completely differently, but I'm just kind of telling you like, okay, this is how you can think of them as being kind of similar, but also different. When D and short S are well formed, you can easily tell them apart. But in the Voynich marginalia, whatever shapes we have going on here are not well formed. People read them as S or D depending on their preferred interpretation of the words. I tried comparing them to similar script samples, but to no avail. As a last resort, I asked professional paleographer Lisa Fagan-Davis's opinion, and she confirmed my suspicion. It's a mess. So in order to avoid contaminating our data with speculation, we decided to ignore them. We do, however, have this really clear and elegant example of an open looped D. So when a manuscript has this, whether it uses exclusively this form or not, it gets a point. So in the sample we're looking at here, it's pretty obvious to me that they like a good loop on their Ds. I don't really see any loopless D at first glance. So that's a 0. The next comparable letter is G, which we define by 2 properties. First, the top is rounded. In many other sources, the top of G is the same horizontal line that forms the connection to the next letter, often with 1 or 2 horns, and we don't want any of those. For the second feature, we focus on the descender, specifically this horizontal part. In some scripts, this line loops all the way back up, sometimes even closing the loop. In the Voynich, the line is straight and quite the opposite of closed. So let's look at our sample. I have not seen a G yet. Let's see. Oh, here's one. So this is clear immediately. The line on top is also the connecting line. There's nothing round here. And also you see the descender. This part is nice, but then we're really looking at this part. It loops back up and it touches the top of the G. We don't want that, so this is 2 zeros for G. Moving on to H, we're looking at 4 properties. First, again, the general category, it's looped. And second, there's a clear descender on the right leg. These properties are usually easy to find. It's the third one that really makes a difference though. We're looking for an H of which the left leg is straight, has no foot, and does not connect to the right leg. Finally, if the document has anywhere any descender on H that's a bit more ornamental that loops back to the right, then that's another point. So in our sample, that's really not been very good so far. We see a looped H, and this left line has no foot, and there's no connection here to the other line, so that's great. There's a descender. Now let's see if we can find any descender where there's an extra like ornamental curve back here. So for example, here on top, this is more than just a descender. There's this double curve going on. So H is looped, it has the descender, the left leg does not connect to the right leg in the bottom, and we found a nice curve on a descender. For L, we track 5 properties, which is the most of any letter. It's looped. The loop is often pointy. The leg is vertical with little to no curve. The foot is tiny or absent, and it does not connect to the next letter. And finally, the loop can be very large. In our sample, we have an L here. Here are 2 L's in a row. They're clearly looped. The loop is kind of pointy. The leg is rather curved. There's a foot. The foot connects to the next letter. The size of the loop can be quite large. So here it connects way past 2/3 of the stem. So that's a point there. Next in our spreadsheet, we have the letter P here. I always like looking for that one because it also makes the difference between decent and really good matches. It definitely suffers from the marginalia openness again, because it's always open at the top, and this gap can be pretty big again. And that's the only property we track, but it's so typical for this script that it's worth including. So in our sample, I see 2 P's here. The letter P can be hard to find, so I'm lucky here. There's also 2 here. We see that they're clearly closed on top, so that's a 0. Our next letter is R, which is also a fun one because it's got all kinds of interesting things going on. First of all, we want to look at the overall shape. Basically, if you look at the R in the Voynich marginalia, it's the shape of a V, right? So we want that. We want a V shape. We want it without a foot. Very often you'll see that they have this horizontal foot at the bottom. We don't want that. And also R has 2 common forms. And the second one isn't always used. It's basically a calligraphic form that's dependent on position. It usually follows rounded letters like O, for example. You can easily spot it by looking for an OR sequence. If the letter R after the O looks different, then your scribe is using R rotunda, as it's called, and the Voynich marginalia scribe does not do that. So the first point, if it's this general V-shaped R without a foot and the sample does not use R rotunda. The second point, if the V is wide and open, connected at the bottom. So looking back at our manuscript here, we see an R here, for example, after A. It's a V shape, but it has a foot and it connects pretty high. So that already is enough to lose both points because it's really just the wrong shape. Here, there's another one after an A and it's almost shaped like an X. Now to find one, here's one after an O. So this is vor. You see it almost looks like Vox, but that's actually an R with a foot. It's not R rotunda though, so they do use the same shape of R in all contexts. Here's another one. But it's so different from the open V-shaped Voynich R that it's 2 times 0 points for this one. Okay, and then we still have to look at X, of course. X can be hard to find in German manuscripts, unless you're lucky enough to find Roman numerals, for example. We have 2 properties here. First, the bottom left extends diagonally straight, further than the top left. Second, there's a loop on the right side. This might be the only case actually where the closed option is used instead of the open option, because they close the loop rather than just leaving it open. Now we know how to find an X in a charter like this, I usually just go to the bottom to try and see if there's a date. You might think that there's an X here, but this is actually und. It's kind of a V shape. Oh, you can see here, for example, they do the same. I'm afraid if there's no X yet here, that there won't be one in the manuscript. I'm just scanning this bottom line here. But no, I don't think we'll find an X here. Now, this manuscript doesn't score high at all. I just knew from the beginning that it would be a very bad match. So I'm not even going to scour it all in the hopes of finding a single X. At this point, that's just a waste of time. And besides, our calculations make it so that the lack of X here doesn't really make any difference. So what I do is I just copy paste this yellow bar in here, and then it's marked here that there is no X. Next there is the dreaded long S, often confused with F by man and machine alike. The first feature is simple. The top doesn't curve down too much. The second feature has to do with the thickness of the lines. Usually the line of the vertical stem will be doubled and thicker, but in the Voynich we see that actually the horizontal line is thicker. In practice though, we saw that it was really hard to work with this property, so we just decided to take it out of the calculations. Column is still there, you can fill it in if you like, but it won't have an effect on the final result. So finally, the letter N is at the end of our list. You'll notice that this isn't really alphabetical. That's because we added to the spreadsheet as we went along and noticed interesting features that we might also track. For N, we look at two properties, which both have to do with the descender. Sometimes scribes will allow this final stroke of a word final N, so when it's at the end of a word, the last stroke, to go below the line, almost like a decorative word end marker. In our Voynich marginalia, the rule appears to be that this is not done. So N, even when it's at the end of the word, or M for that matter, does not get this descender. However, in this one word at the bottom line, there's a very clear counterexample. It's quite elegant, slightly curving back at the bottom, similar to what often happens with the descender of H. So we decided to reward both. If the general rule in a sample is that word final N gets no descender, that's a point. And if there's any curved descender in there, that's another point. Often you'll find these more elaborate curved descenders at the bottom line where there's a bit more space, so it's always worthwhile to have a look there if you're looking for one. Remember, for long S, which we haven't filled in yet, we were looking for this part, this horizontal line that does not curve down. In Voynich it's kind of straight. It might curve down slightly, but it does not do this. Also here you can see how comparatively thick this vertical line is. In the Voynich it's very thin, but remember we don't actually use that in our calculations, but here it's a clear counterexample of this very thick doubled vertical line of long S. This is a definite 0 points. Then looking at N. N and M, you can compare them. They're quite similar in this regard. So here we say, here we have an N at the end of the word. It does not get a descender. This M does not get a descender. Here's an N without a descender. So that's a point. The general rule appears to be that N does not get a descender, but I see here on the same line that they did add one here, and it's a very nice one with this curve going back here. So it earns both points here when it comes to the descenders on the N. That's 2 zeros for S and 2 1s for N. Here at the end are some things we once tracked but are no longer necessary for the calculations because for various reasons we decided that it just did not work. So you can just ignore these or you can fill them in if you like, but I'm not gonna talk about these anymore in the video. So now let's see what this does for our calculations. Here we just make this longer. Okay, so it gets 0.40, which is really, really bad. It's white colored, which means this scale goes from green to white to red. So it means it's somewhere in the middle. In the end, Marco and I tracked 33 properties, of which 28 were used to count towards the final result. We did so for 382 samples, which means we filled in over 12,000 values, each based on careful analysis of medieval handwriting. Add to that the work and time it takes to go through online archives trying to obtain a wide geographical and chronological spread of samples, and finding and filling in all the relevant data like shelf mark, date, and place of origin. It's needless to say that this has been the most labor-intensive Voynich project I've ever been involved in. But we learned a lot about both time and place. Let's start with place. Earlier I said I had no expectations about the location where the scribe was active. If the marginalia may have been written by a later owner, then this person could have come from anywhere and they wouldn't necessarily have had anything to do with the creation of the manuscript. However, if we do hypothesize a connection to the writer's location and that of the manuscript's production, we can make some predictions. The infamous swallowtail merlins on the rosettes fold-out lead us to Italy, extant examples of swallowtail buildings that already existed in the early 15th century are not found above the southern Alpine passes. However, we are quite certain that some of the words we can read in this text are in German. So people have usually been looking at the intersection between these two factors. The more you go to the south, the more familiar people would have been with swallowtail architecture. The more we go to the north, the more German speakers there are. With that in mind, here's what we learned about the places where people wrote like this. I'll quickly list first where we did not find any good matches, and then highlight 3 more fruitful areas. Basically, any area dominated by a Romance language yields poor results, at least in our experience. Think of France and its sphere of influence, like the Low Countries and Alsace, the Iberian Peninsula, but also Italy, somewhat to my surprise. Less surprising is a lack of good hits in the British Isles, which are insular by definition. We also did not find much anywhere east of Germany, and even in Austria our success was very limited. This is kind of what the first stage of our investigation looks like. After digging through many different archives from different countries, we hadn't really stumbled onto anything of significance yet. It was during one of those excursions into remote lands that I stumbled upon our first success. For a period during our research, the best matches for the marginalia script known to us, and as far as I'm aware to anyone at that time, were from, I kid you not, Scandinavia. Sometimes they were even written in German, because these places were effectively the northern reaches of the Hanseatic League, the Northern European trading network connecting the areas shown on this map. Note that we did not find good results in the rest of the League, only in these northern extremities. In our current ranking of almost 400 samples, we find documents from Sweden on the 8th, 9th, 13th and 14th place. Estonia's capital, then known as Reval, on the 11th place. Denmark on the 16th place. We now consider this a coincidence, but it's interesting nonetheless. I can guarantee that if you spend an hour going through medieval charters in the Swedish National Archives and then another hour doing the same anywhere in Italy, we will find far better handwriting matches for the marginalia in Sweden. For a while at least, it looked like I would need to explain to you today why we now believe the marginalia were written by a Scandinavian immigrant. Which is possible, by the way. People in the Middle Ages were able to move around by land and by sea. Our story doesn't stop there, though. Granted, there are Scandinavian examples in the top 2% of our results, which nobody saw coming, but eventually we found a handful of better samples. Since I don't expect everyone to know the location of every German town, I will add them to the map as we go along. You might notice a certain clustering here in our top 10. Some of these top samples were found by Marco, others by me, so we kind of independently converged on this particular area. The first and second places are both from a city called Fulda in the German state of Hessen. Number 3 is from Groß-Umstadt. We'll skip number 4 for a moment. We'll get back to that later. The 5th place is from a charter from Kaufungen. 6, one from Bechtolsheim. 7 from somewhere around Mainz. 8 and 9 are from Sweden, as I mentioned before. and 10 is from Hessen, without any mention of a specific city. This means that our entire top 3 and 7 out of our top 10 entries are all from 2 neighboring German states, Hessen and Rhineland-Pfalz, around the cities of Fulda and Mainz. Interestingly, when we overlay these locations with a map of West Central German dialects, we see that they are, at least today, linguistically very closely related. I do not know at all whether this has any influence on handwriting though, but I thought I'd point it out nonetheless. Now, about that number 4 we skipped. For over a year I thought that this would be the story I'd be telling you today. After a brief sightseeing tour in Scandinavia, Marco and I ended up in a still more northern than expected German state that hadn't really been on anyone's radar that I know of. But as it turns out, we were suffering from a certain deficiency, a magnesium deficiency. Mere weeks before this video was set to go live, a Voynich Ninja member by the name of Magnesium posted this to the forum, a Swiss manuscript that he called an extremely good reference for the marginalia. Everybody agreed that this was an exceptional find, and I don't remember any marginalia parallel causing such a stir before. Even Lisa Fagin Davis was there. When Marco and I rated this sample, it ended up on the 4th place, which is basically at the top, because the difference there are pretty small. So that's an entry to add to our map in the area of Zurich. Not quite in Swallowtail Merlin territory, but closer to where people expect the action to be. With a complete top 10 on the map now, we get 2 results in Sweden, 7 around Fulda and Mainz, and 1 around Zurich. I'll also show you the rest of the top 20, but keep in mind that scores have dropped pretty quickly at this point. We get some further padding of the Scandinavian and Central German regions, as well as 1 other location in Switzerland, 1 in northern Austria and 1 near Nuremberg. Where the story of the writer's geographical origin is complex, that of his most likely time frame is very simple. Let me show you. So the radiocarbon dating has shown that the parchment of the Voynich manuscript was most likely prepared in this period. Then the question is, are the marginalia written by one of the original scribes, as the presence of a nymph and Voynich cheese might suggest, or are they the result of a later intervention? Well, here are the dates of our top 10 results. Top 20. You know what, I'll put the entire top 50 on here. It became clear to us pretty soon that this particular style of cursiva is, for lack of a better term, medieval. It's not that we didn't look at later documents. In fact, we included 140 samples dated to the second half of the 15th century or later. But they just tend to be awful matches. Someone writing like this was most likely to be active before or during the period marked by the radiocarbon dating. So, what does this all mean for our understanding of the Voynich manuscript? First of all, it's clear that from our manuscript's frame of reference, this is an early script. Taking into account the presence of Voynich cheese, a drawing of a nymph, and the chronological data we discussed here, the evidence now strongly weighs in favor of the marginalia being contemporaneous with the writing of the manuscript itself. Related to this, and more importantly, we now have further evidence that the manuscript's main Voynich cheese text, and at least the penwork for the drawings, was done soon after the vellum was acquired. Some people believe the manuscript was written on old parchment, making its contents more recent than its material, but this position has now become even more untenable. When we started this project, we had never hoped to be able to hone in on specific locations. Writing was an international business with traveling scribes, interconnected courts, trade relations, and so on. This becomes evident from all the decent matches we found in a place like Scandinavia. However, regional variation does exist, since it proved nearly impossible to find any good parallels in northern Germany, regions to the east of Germany, France, Spain, England, and even Italy. One top match was found in a manuscript from Zurich, but The majority of most similar samples come from around the central German cities Mainz and Fulda. It's important to stress that we are not claiming that the Voynich manuscript was made in Fulda. But based on the evidence we have available at the moment, it looks like one of the manuscript scribes may have been trained in this area. As the magnesium enrichment event shows though, we unfortunately weren't able to analyze all the millions of digitized documents out there, and I definitely don't consider this research finished. What we provide most of all is a structured system for this one specific purpose. Any good-looking handwriting sample you come across can be added, and you'll immediately see how it compares to anything else we've collectively accumulated. If you think Marco and I neglected your favorite medieval country, then this is your time to shine. We'll make a copy of our spreadsheet available so you can assess samples yourself and add to our collective knowledge of the script. It would be particularly interesting to see if the area around Zurich or anything closer to the Alps can be reinforced. As things stand now though, it looks like at least one of the Voynich scribes came from central Germany, and they wrote this text in the early 15th century. To close things off, I really have to thank Marco Ponzi for the countless hours he dedicated to this research and his contributions to this video. And of course all the people at Voynich Ninja who helped with finding samples and resources.